10 U.S. states are ready to become Canadian provinces. What if parts of the U.S. already feel more Canadian than American? We're not just talking about geography here. We're talking about mindset, culture, and everyday lifestyle. From cold winters and maple syrup to hockey, healthcare values, and a love of the outdoors, these 10 U.S. states are quietly blending into Canada's identity. Some border Canada, others just act like they belong there. Whether it's their politics, their accents, or even how they drive in snow, these places already walk, talk, and shovel like Canadians. In fact, if you swap the U.S. flag for a maple leaf in some of these states, most folks wouldn't even blink. So today, we're counting down the 10 U.S. states that are basically unofficial Canadian provinces. Stick around because number 1 just might blow your mind. Number 10, Oregon. At number 10, we have Oregon, a state that often feels like British Columbia's younger sibling. From the misty forests of Portland to the eco-conscious communities along the coast, Oregon mirrors Canada in more ways than most Americans realize. First, let's talk about culture. Oregonians are famously progressive, community-driven, and polite, much like their neighbors just north of the border. Recycling is almost a religion here. Sustainability isn't just a buzzword, it's a lifestyle. Sound familiar? That's because British Columbia shares nearly identical values. Now add in Oregon's love of nature and outdoor adventure. Hiking, skiing, kayaking, and camping dominate weekend plans. Much like Canadians, Oregonians know how to embrace the wilderness. And then there's the weather, rainy, cool, and cloudy, just like Vancouver. If you can handle 8 months of drizzle, you'll fit in on either side of the border. Portland and Vancouver, they're often compared as cultural twins. Quirky, creative, coffee-loving cities that march to their own beat. Even politically, Oregon's approach to healthcare, education, and environmental policy is very Canadian style. Not to mention, Oregon was one of the first U.S. states to legalize cannabis, decriminalize small drug possession, and implement universal vote by mail. Those moves are very Canadian in tone. The only thing missing might be hockey, but don't worry, the fans are out there. If Oregon woke up tomorrow as Canada's 11th province, a lot of people probably wouldn't notice the difference. So yes, Oregon still flies the stars and stripes, but its soul might already be wearing a maple leaf. Number 9, Maine. At number 9, we head to the northeastern tip of the U.S., where Maine quietly blends into Canadian culture more than most realize. First off, Maine shares a long border with Quebec and New Brunswick. In many small towns, you'll hear French spoken just as often as English. The cultural crossover here is real. Lobster traps line the rocky coastline. The forests are deep, quiet, and cold. And the pace of life, slow, polite, and community-first, just like rural Canada. Over 90% of Maine is covered by forest, making it one of the most heavily wooded states in the U.S. and eerily similar to New Brunswick. People here don't just live with nature, they rely on it. Fishing, logging, and maple syrup production all echo classic Canadian industries. Long, snowy winters dominate the region with temperatures that feel straight out of Ontario. Snowmobiles and wood stoves aren't just hobbies, they're necessities. The architecture in Maine also mirrors parts of Atlantic Canada. You'll find clapboard houses, steep roofs, and cozy town centers that wouldn't look out of place in Nova Scotia. Even the accent, that down east drawl, sometimes sounds closer to Canadian maritime English than to Boston. Politically, Maine leans independent, like Quebec's fiercely local identity. Its healthcare and environmental policies lean progressive, another nod to northern influence. So while Maine may be proudly American, there's no denying it feels like an unofficial province of Canada. And if Quebec ever needed a backup province across the border, Maine's probably already halfway in. Number 8. Minnesota. Minnesota isn't just close to Canada. It practically feels like Canada's cultural cousin. From its freezing winters to its love of hockey and fishing, this state shares more than just a border. Let's start with the climate. Minnesota endures some of the coldest, snowiest winters in the U.S. With blizzards, sub-zero temperatures, and frozen lakes, life here looks a lot like Manitoba or Saskatchewan. And Minnesotans embrace it. Ice fishing, snowmobiling, and skiing are core parts of local life, just like in Canada. Then there's hockey. It's not just a sport here, it's a religion. Minnesota has been called the state of hockey, and kids start skating almost as soon as they can walk. Culturally, the state's Scandinavian heritage mirrors many Canadian provinces. Think humility, politeness, and that famous Minnesota nice attitude. Sound familiar? It's not so different from how Canadians are known worldwide. Even the accents are surprisingly close. Yeah, if you've ever heard a Minnesotan say "you betcha," it's not far off from a friendly Canadian, eh? Politically, Minnesota leans progressive, with strong support for public education, environmental regulation, and accessible health care, very much in line with Canadian values. It also shares a massive border with Canada, including access to Ontario and Manitoba. Some small northern towns even rely on Canadian media signals and cross-border commerce. In fact, cross-border fishing, tourism, and family ties are a regular part of life here. Minnesota is proudly American, but in many ways, it already lives like a Canadian province. So, if Canada ever wanted to adopt a new member, Minnesota would probably slide right in, skates and all. Number 7. Vermont. Vermont might be small in size, but when it comes to Canadian vibes, it punches way above its weight. Tucked into the Northeast, Vermont is often described as the most Canadian-feeling New England state. Let's start with the scenery. Rolling green hills, thick maple forests, and charming small towns. It's like a cross between rural Quebec and Nova Scotia. And yes, the maple syrup is real here and fiercely protected. Vermont and Quebec are actually the two largest maple syrup producers in North America. The love for nature doesn't stop at syrup. Vermonters are obsessed with hiking, biking, skiing, and sustainable living. Sound familiar? That's because it mirrors the eco-conscious mindset of Canadians, especially in British Columbia and Quebec. Politically, Vermont is deeply progressive. It was the first U.S. state to legalize civil unions, supports universal healthcare initiatives, and emphasizes community-based governance. Those are values you'd expect to find just across the northern border. And then there's the attitude. Vermonters are known for being polite, independent, and proudly local, much like rural Canadians. Big box stores are rare. Local farmers markets, co-ops, and artisan shops thrive. Even the pace of life feels Canadian, calm, intentional, and connected to the land. Vermont also borders Quebec and shares cultural and economic exchanges with French-speaking communities. It's not unusual to hear French spoken in northern Vermont, or see Quebec license plates in local parking lots. In so many ways, Vermont isn't just geographically close to Canada, it's spiritually aligned. If Canada ever decided to annex one American state quietly, Vermont would probably say, "Sure, as long as we can still ski on our own side." Number 6. Washington. Washington might be firmly part of the U.S., but in many ways it feels like Canada's West Coast twin. Let's begin with geography. Washington shares a direct border with British Columbia, and cities like Seattle and Vancouver are often compared, and for good reason. Both are coastal, cosmopolitan, and surrounded by mountains, water, and dense forests. They're also cultural hubs of art, tech, coffee, and progressive values. Seattleites and Vancouverites dress alike, eat alike, and even complain about the same rainy weather. If you switch the skyline labels, most tourists wouldn't know the difference. But the Canadian parallels go deeper than aesthetics. Washington State is deeply committed to environmental sustainability. From banning plastic bags to investing in green energy, the state mirrors Canada's eco-first mindset, especially British Columbia. The culture is community-driven and polite, with an emphasis on inclusivity and social awareness. Even healthcare advocacy is strong, with many Washingtonians supporting universal-style systems and expanded access, another Canadian trait. Tech-wise, Seattle is a global center, but it still shares business and workforce ties with Vancouver. Cross-border collaboration in film, software, and biotech is common. And for residents living near the border, quick trips to Canada for weekend escapes are just part of life. Washington is also one of the most bike-friendly and walkable states, like Canada's urban centers. And let's not forget the social energy. Both regions pride themselves on multiculturalism, environmental justice, and strong public services. From rain-soaked hiking trails to organic markets and co-ops, Washington feels like it borrowed a few pages from Canada's playbook. It may still fly the stars and stripes, but Washington's spirit is proudly Pacific Northwest and undeniably Canadian. Number 5. New Hampshire. New Hampshire may not be the first state you think of when it comes to Canadian vibes, but it quietly fits the mold better than most. Start with the geography. New Hampshire borders Quebec, and small towns in the north have long-standing cultural and economic ties with French-speaking communities across the border. You'll hear French surnames, see Quebec license plates, and feel the bilingual presence in local businesses. The state is known for its rugged landscape, mountains, lakes, and deep woods, much like the Canadian provinces of Quebec and New Brunswick. Snowmobiles, ice fishing, and log cabins aren't tourist attractions here. They're everyday life. And then there's the pace. New Hampshire is calm, quiet, and proudly independent. Its residents value self-reliance and small government, echoing the do-it-yourself spirit found in rural parts of Canada. It's also one of the few U.S. states with no sales tax, similar to several Canadian provinces with harmonized or regional tax systems. That economic setup draws in Canadian shoppers and makes border towns surprisingly connected. Politically, New Hampshire is a bit of a wild card. It's known for its live free or die motto, yet also embraces community health care, environmental protections, and strong civic engagement, values that overlap with Canadian governance. And culturally, there's a shared love for maple syrup, flannel shirts, and talking about the weather. The White Mountains could easily be mistaken for parts of southern Quebec. New Hampshire may not be flashy, but it's steady, resilient, and outdoorsy, a classic Canadian combo. If Canada ever annexed New England, New Hampshire wouldn't need to change much. It's already halfway there. Number 4. Michigan. At number 4, we've got Michigan, one of the few U.S. states that literally connects to Canada by bridge, tunnel, and even friendship. Let's talk geography. Michigan shares an extensive border with Ontario, and the two are linked by major crossings like the Ambassador Bridge and the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel. In fact, standing in downtown Detroit, you can see Canada right across the river. This proximity has shaped everything from trade to culture. Cross-border commuting is common for workers and students, and many Michiganders have friends or family in Ontario. Culturally, there's significant overlap. Detroit and Windsor share sports rivalries, radio stations, and even a similar local accent. And in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, or Yooper territory, the rural lifestyle, snow-covered towns, and friendly small communities feel almost indistinguishable from northern Ontario. Winters are long, harsh, and snowy. Snowmobiles, hockey, and ice fishing aren't just pastimes, they're survival strategies. There's also a shared love for the outdoors. From Great Lakes kayaking to camping deep in the pines, Michigan and Ontario share that deep connection to nature. Politically, Michigan swings, but its support for public education, union labor, and community health care align closely with Canadian values. In terms of infrastructure, both sides invest heavily in binational trade, tourism, and environmental protection. The Great Lakes don't care about borders, and neither do the people who live around them. So while Michigan may be proudly American, its daily rhythm often beats in sync with Canada. If borders ever got redrawn around culture and lifestyle instead of politics, Michigan might already have one foot in Ontario. Number 3. Montana. At number 3, we've got Montana, a massive mountainous state that shares more than just a border with Canada. Let's start with the geography. Montana has a 545-mile border with Alberta, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan. That's one of the longest uninterrupted borders between any U.S. state and Canada. The connection runs deeper than maps. Montana and Alberta are linked by Waterton Glacier International Peace Park, a joint UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's the only park in the world managed by two countries as a single ecosystem, a symbol of shared values around nature conservation and cooperation. Culturally, Montana feels like a mirror of Western Canada. The rural lifestyle, cowboy heritage, hunting traditions, and deep respect for land echo everything you'd find in Alberta or Saskatchewan. People wave to strangers, pickup trucks line every small town street, and rugged independence is more than a mindset, it's a necessity. The climate also lines up. Long winters, massive snowfalls, and unpredictable weather systems sweep across the northern prairies, both in Montana and across the border. Snowmobiles, wood stoves, and layered flannel are essential gear here and there. Economically, agriculture and natural resources dominate both sides. Montana and Canada's prairie provinces depend on wheat, cattle, and oil, and share many of the same trade patterns. Even politically, Montana's mix of libertarianism and community-mindedness matches Canada's western provinces, which balance individual freedom with social stability. There's even cultural exchange. Canadians come south for rodeos and skiing. Montanans head north for hunting trips or to visit family. So while Montana might be American on paper, its heartbeat runs parallel to Western Canada. If Alberta ever needed a sibling across the line, Montana's already in the family photo. Number 2, Alaska. Coming in at number 2 is Alaska, a state that might as well be Canada's remote western province. Start with the basics. Alaska shares the longest land border with Canada of any U.S. state, over 1,500 miles. It's surrounded by the Yukon and British Columbia. And in many places, the nearest major city is actually in Canada. But it's not just about proximity. Alaska and northern Canada share the same climate, terrain, and way of life. Massive snowfalls, short daylight hours, and isolated communities are part of everyday reality. When it comes to transportation, supply chains, and even emergency coordination, Alaska often works more closely with Canada than the rest of the U.S. For example, many Alaskans travel through Canada to reach other parts of their own state. The famed Alaska Highway, built during World War II, runs straight through Canada, a literal lifeline connecting Alaskan towns to the lower 48. Culturally, there's strong overlap too. Fishing, trapping, hunting, and small plane flying are all staples of both Alaskan and northern Canadian lifestyles. Indigenous communities along the border share language, heritage, and traditions that go back centuries, long before borders existed. Politically, Alaska is fiercely independent, but its blend of rugged self-reliance and respect for natural resources mirrors the Canadian North's governance and values. Even environmentally, both regions face similar battles, from melting permafrost to protecting caribou migration routes. In many ways, Alaska and the Canadian territories function like neighbors with shared responsibilities. So while Alaska may be far from Washington, D.C., it's deeply connected to Whitehorse and Yellowknife. If Canada ever wanted to expand westward, Alaska might already be waiting, parka on, snow boots laced. Number 1. North Dakota. Taking the number 1 spot is North Dakota, a state that's so culturally and structurally connected to Canada that it's practically Canada's 11th province in disguise. First, the obvious. North Dakota shares a long border with Manitoba and Saskatchewan. Small border towns like Pembina and Portal are practically merged with their Canadian counterparts. Families, businesses, and even churches cross the line without thinking twice. But the ties go deeper than that. North Dakota and Manitoba are connected through the same power grid, share emergency weather alert systems, and coordinate on flood management across the Red River Basin. In winter, their landscapes are nearly identical: endless snow-covered plains, white skies, and bone-chilling winds. Residents of both regions survive blizzards, black ice, and frozen pipelines, and they've developed the same calm, rugged attitude to handle it. The cultures are strikingly similar. Small-town values, tight-knit communities, and a strong reliance on farming, trucking, and oil production shape both sides of the border. You're just as likely to see a snowmobile parked at a gas station in Grand Forks as you are in Winnipeg. Even the Midwestern politeness, often joked about in the U.S., feels exactly like Canadian courtesy. People in North Dakota say sorry even when you bump into them. And accents? Let's just say there's not much difference between a North Dakota "oh yeah" and a Manitoba "eh." Politically, North Dakota is more conservative, but its social cohesion and respect for public services mirror rural Canadian provinces. If you swapped the flags, not much would change. North Dakota already lives, works, and weathers life like a prairie province. All that's missing is the maple leaf. That wraps up our countdown of the 10 U.S. states that already feel like they belong to Canada. From shared borders to shared values, these places prove that the line between countries isn't always so clear. Do you agree with our list? Did we miss a state that's secretly more Canadian than American? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're here, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.